By the time our young Mozart was 11 years old, he was well on his way to becoming a full-fledged composer. He was not composing in a young, immature way. He was writing very substantial music well beyond his years, which was the way he lived most of his life. By the time he was 11, he began writing an opera, which is a massive, massive feat because opera was the highest art form really in the later years of Mozart's life and on after his death. Basically, an opera today would feel almost like a musical movie. It was a combination of all of the art forms. You would have singing, you would have dance, and you would have performance on a stage, musical theater. And of course, with all of this, you would have to have an orchestra or some sort of a band down in front of the stage to perform all of the music. Because remember, there were no recordings. We did not have CDs, radio. If you wanted to hear music, it had to be performed in front of you back in these days. To write an opera was a huge deal because it couldn't just be 15, 20 minutes. You needed well over an hour's worth of material, and it would not be unusual to have almost 2.5 to 4 hours of material. So for an 11-year-old to begin writing an opera with all of the music, the storyline, huge feat for someone to do. By the time Mozart was in his teenage years, he was producing some works that to this day garner huge fame. But with this, of course, became a bit of tension because Mozart was now a teenager. And as many people know, and as the movies often tell us, teenagers often have arguments with their parents. Now, Leopold was making the whole family's money off of the successes of our young Mozart. But now that our young Mozart was becoming a man of his own, he kind of wanted to make money for himself rather than his whole family. And of course, this started to really cause a tension between his father and himself. Young Mozart would continue to stay as a freelance musician rather than joining the courts, the nobility families who would pay you regularly, as most of the contemporary successful people of Mozart's time chose to do. Mozart would really start to stress the money he had. He would not have as much of it, but his immaturity would also show through in some of his works. We even have a piece that dates back to
KV 231. So he already wrote 231 pieces of music by 1782? I wonder what this song's title means.
Mozart would continue to write some pieces of music for all the very popular genres of the time, which were known as basically by their song type, which could include a sonata, a concerto, an opera, a symphony, to name a few. And really understanding each one of these styles will make sense with time. It takes a lot of study and listening, but we're going to take a look at a few today. Whenever you would write back in these days, it was not very common to name every single piece of music you wrote. Many times, if you wrote a symphony and it was your first time writing a symphony, your piece would be entitled Symphony Number 1. And if you wrote another symphony, instead of giving it a name, your next one would be Symphony Number 2, and so on. So when we take a look at a lot of classical music, you may see these kind of weird names that don't really seem to say anything. They're usually the type of song it is, and then the number of that type of song that that person has made in their lifetime. Okay? So we'll see that as we get further today. Mozart would go on to write, as we found today, scholars have gone back, tried to find every single writing that he's done of all of his music, and they all total up to somewhere around 600 pieces of music, which was absolutely absurd, seeing as when Mozart got into his 30s, after 25 years of steady writing professional grade music, he became quite ill, and his final illness finally struck him dead just past midnight on December the 5th of 1791, shortly, not too many weeks before he would have turned 36 years old. When Mozart died, he had been working on a piece of music known as a Requiem Mass. Now, a Requiem was actually meant to be performed at a funeral mass for someone who died. So the fact that his last piece of music, even left slightly unfinished, was actually about death kind of shows to us that Mozart knew that he was not long for this world. And he would leave the world behind in 1791 with, like we said before, a huge catalog of very high quality music that went on to really change how people write music ever since. Now, today I'm going to give you guys a short video with a few tunes from some of Mozart's most famous music, all performed on a piano. Now, of course, the originals of these, if it was a symphony, would have been performed by a symphony orchestra. A concerto would have highlighted a particular instrument, a solo instrument, whether that be violin or piano or something else, accompanied by a small orchestra. If it was a sonata, that would just really explain the form of the song and the organization of the different tunes ideas within that song. Now, just writing these songs were not what made Mozart famous. It's the influence he had on each one of these song styles. Because just simply writing one was not exactly a huge feat. Hundreds of people at that time did write them and are completely lost to history. The reason that we remember Mozart so much is he was able to find a balance and an emotion through his music that people to this day can still relate to well over 200 years after his death. When it came to the concerto, taking a solo instrument and blending it with an orchestra was often quite difficult because the orchestra would have many more than 15 people in most cases, and the solo instrument would have to kind of compete with that. Mozart found a nice way for these to have a nice balance to them while also conveying a nice feeling of emotion, most of the time with music that had no words as it was being performed by musical instruments. When it came to the song form known as a symphony, Mozart produced 41 symphonies in his lifetime, which by today's standards is absolutely ridiculous. Even from just a few years after, to write 41 symphonies would equal a combination of a multitude of other very famous composers just a few short years after him. The symphony style requires you to write for a full orchestra with multiple movements within a overall piece of music. So think about a symphony almost like a modern day EP or a short CD or record, where you have first movement would almost be like its first song. Movement two would be a different sort of song, maybe a little bit softer, maybe not, but a different theme than your first movement. Movement three, again something different, but would be very common to pull ideas or themes back from the first two movements. Most symphonies would have four movements, and really that would be your magnum opus, kind of pulls back all the famous ideas from before and puts a period on the sentence. And overall, you end up with this very long piece of music that in itself, one symphony could be a whole concert. Granted, it must be said that Mozart's symphonies were usually much shorter than the symphonies that would come just a few years after his death, but his influence on the style really made the symphony the high form of art music from thereafter. Up to this day, Mozart's symphonies are performed very regularly by orchestras around the world, and many people pay a lot of money to go see these performances. For simple comparison, one of the other big three I mentioned earlier, who was also one of the kings of the symphony, Ludwig van Beethoven, in his lifetime would only write a total of 9 symphonies. Granted, his symphonies would stretch up to about an hour or longer in length in comparison to Mozart's, which were usually give or take 20 minutes or so in length if you were to go see a performance. Still an absolute incredible feat to write 41 symphonies. Now, I'm going to give you guys a short video here that goes over the tunes from a number of Mozart's most famous works. I'm not going to make you sit through full pieces of his work because, like we said just a few minutes ago, some of them could go on for 15 to 20 minutes. I really want to see how well you recognize some of Mozart's tunes. These have been around for over 230 years. So I want to just see how well you recognize some of them. So take a look at this video, check it out. It's performed by kind of a funny guy here, but a really awesome piano player. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Okay, my friends, I really encourage you to watch that video that I've put here from YouTube on our last enrichment time of the day. And make sure you check out the exit ticket questions. I have some questions about information we've already talked about so far. Plus, I want you to get some of your reaction to the video that I've linked from YouTube for our last time together later today. So, all right, guys, have fun with it. Good luck in your next class, and I will see you next week.